In the arts and craft market, they say shiny sells. Well, I'm here to tell you, it does. My customers love my finish. And there's certainly a degree and some satisfaction that comes from seeing the wood grain glimmer from inside a shiny finish. You want to know how I do it? Then stick around. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Phil. Welcome to my shop. This is the final video of a 3-part series on how I make Mr. Majestic, my Tuscany-inspired vase. If you missed the first two, the links are listed in the show notes below. So without further ado, let's finish this thing. Here's where we left off in the last video. The surface is all smooth and ready for sanding. Now it's no secret that the trick to a beautiful finish all starts with the sanding. Now sometimes you got to get a little creative to try to get into those tough spots to sand. The neck of this vase is about 14 inches deep. I just cut a little piece off a broomstick handle, split it down the middle with my bandsaw, and attached it to a little stick. I glued on a little rubber pad made from a bicycle inner tube, and then glued on the male end of some Velcro. I usually start out with 80 grit, then I'll go to 120, then 150, then 220, then 320, and I'll finish up with 400 and then 600. Now it's very important that you stop the lathe and you check your work between grits. And each grit should simply be removing the lines from the previous sandpaper. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a new woodworker that worked their way to 600, only to find a line that was still there from 60 grit. As you see, I'm power sanding here. I'll power sand with every grit right up to 320. And then 400 and 600 I do by hand. I keep a compressor line near my lathe. It really helps cleaning out pieces and cleaning sandpaper as well. Now one of the tricks that I do is I sand in both directions. For example, let's say I'm sanding at 60 grit. Well, once I've sanded for a few minutes, I'll stop the lathe, and then I'll reverse the direction of the lathe, and then continue to sand for a couple more minutes. So what you need to realize is when you're sanding, the sandpaper is cutting the wood fibers, but it's also matting down other fibers. So all these other fibers that are matted down, or burnished if you will, when the time comes you put your wet finish on there, they're going to all pop up. However, reversing the direction of the sanding greatly eliminates that problem, because when you sand in reverse, the sandpaper is now lifting those matted fibers and cutting them off smooth. So if you get in the habit of reversing the direction of the lathe between every single grit of sandpaper, at the end, I can guarantee you'll hardly have any raised grain when you put your finish on. As you can see here, I'm repairing a chip that was caused from the turning process. Fill the void with sawdust, add a drop of CA glue, hit it with some accelerator, and you're good to go. So here I start sanding my last 2 grits, which I do by hand, 400 grit and 600 grit, and I attach my sandpaper to a soft sponge pad. So now that the inside is done, I bring up my tailpiece, move the steady rest out of the way, and I start sanding the outside. Now when you're sanding copper, you're going to notice that your sandpaper is going to get dirty real fast. And I found that the copper dust tends to stain your wood. To correct that, I use a separate pad just for the copper area alone. Now you notice here that I'm not power sanding, but using long strips of sandpaper on the column. I use this method to keep the column nice and straight. Your eye is very keen at picking out straight edges. If I were to power sand this column, it would probably have a little bit of a wavy appearance. And again, that compressor hose really comes in handy cleaning out sandpaper. Now that the aggressive grits are out of the way, I will go back to power sanding starting at 220. Okay, now that I'm done with the main sanding, it's time to take a nice dry tack cloth and rub out as much dust as I possibly can. Of course, before I started this, I did blow everything off really good with the compressor. Now, just as I do with my sanding, I'll wipe in both directions with my tack cloth as well. Now, if you don't have a tack cloth, you can easily make one with a shop towel dampened with a little bit of mineral spirits. Now it's time to add my sanding sealer, and I make my own sealer. It's just brushing lacquer and denatured alcohol, a 50-50 mix. The sealer's water thin, so it really seeps into all the pores in the wood grain very deep and well. And the denatured alcohol evaporates so swiftly that the whole piece is dry just within 30 seconds. The sanding sealer step is very important. If there's any loose wood fibers, this product will make sure that they're all locked in place. I'll usually apply about 3 or 4 coats. Then I'll allow the whole piece to cure for about 30 minutes before I give it a light sanding with 4 and 600 grit. To get that sealer down that long neck, I use that same stick with a few shop towels wrapped around it. And now that the piece is cured, I'll go back and do a light sanding with 400 grit and then finish up with 600 grit. Now, here's the real secret to my finish. Before I spray my lacquer, I wipe my whole piece down with a chunk of Tripoli buffing compound. I turn the lathe up to about 1,000 revs, and I really let that wax melt into the piece, and I rub it really good all over the piece.
Oh, hey, you're still watching. Well, that must mean you liked my video. Wonderful. Hey, could you do me a favor and click that like and subscribe button down here? I would appreciate it. And ring that bell so you won't miss any future videos. Thanks a lot.
Now, for those of you that don't know, Tripoli is a microcrystalline rock sediment that naturally forms in the earth. It's got a lot of industrial uses. In this case, it's used in a buffing compound. To make the buffing compound, all they do is simply mix it with some carnauba wax. Now, once I've applied the Tripoli, I'll then increase the lathe speed up to about 2,000 RPMs. I'll then take a dry paper towel and I'll buff the piece for several minutes. I'll then replace that paper towel with a clean one, and I'll buff it again without adding any more Tripoli. The second dry buffing removes any wax sediment that may be left behind. The results gives me a beautiful, smooth, natural finish. Now for those of you that just like a plain natural finish, you're done. The piece is beautiful. But then unfortunately over time, the piece will lose its luster and dry out. That's why I prefer a sealed finish. Now I make my own spray lacquer. It's very easy. The only ingredients you need is acetone, lacquer thinner, and I like to use Minwax clear brushing lacquer. Now I prefer clear gloss, however you can use semi-gloss as well. I like to use my small detailed sprayer. This one here is very inexpensive. I picked it up at Harbor Freight and it works really good. I like to mix my lacquer up 18 ounces at a time. And I like to save these old spaghetti jars as they already have ounces written right on them. Now after a lot of trial and error, I stumbled upon a recipe that works really well for me. I mix 10 ounces of brushing lacquer, 6 ounces of lacquer thinner, and then 2 ounces of acetone. Before you start spraying lacquer, it's really a good idea to have a respirator on. I set the air pressure in my sprayer at 25 psi. Now the trick to spraying lacquer is that you move the gun very slowly from side to side. Slow enough that the lacquer you're leaving behind appears to be wet. And if it appears to look too dry, then you're moving the gun too swiftly. I have a small air conditioner in my shop. If the moisture's too high, I'll turn the air conditioner on and I'll set the controls so it's just circulating the air within my shop and not bringing any more moisture in from outside. Now when you're spraying lacquer, it's very important that your shop's humidity is below 60%. If it's over 60%, then you may get a blushing. The blushing effect is when moisture in the air gets caught underneath the layer of lacquer. And then once the lacquer dries, it's going to have a milky appearance. And I've got my lathe turning at about 200 RPMs. When I bought my lathe, I also bought a big hood scoop for my dust collector. You can see it here in the background, and it collects all the dust very well. And in this situation, it's collecting a lot of overspray. I've got a cyclone unit built into my dust collector, and I have it set up so anything 3 microns and below get vented outside, including this overspray. So after 3 coats of lacquer and allowing it to dry overnight, it's time to part it off. For this, I'm using a freshly sharpened 1/8 parting tool. And I'll just go down far enough where I've got about 2 inches left, and I'll cut the rest off with a saw. Once off the lathe, I turn it upside down and I start to finish the bottom. For this I use my little angle grinder with a 60 grit flapper. The goal here is not only to flatten out that nub, but also to create a nice concave surface. This way the vessel will always sit flat and never wobble. I then switch over to my orbital disc sander. With this I start at 80 grit and I work up to 320. And then I just wipe on a couple of coats of brushing lacquer straight out of the can. And there he is, Mr. Majestic. I'm very pleased how it came out. And by using only 3 light layers of lacquer, I still maintain that wood grain. I like to feel the grain in my piece. The majority of my customers love this finish as well. Too many coats of lacquer will give a plastic appearance.
Where did the time slip away? Well, that concludes our 3-part video series. I really hope you found some value in it. If you learned something today, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to ring that bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Phil DeCarlo, and until the next one, cheers.